Domestic violence is a serious issue. It affects millions of people. It doesn't discriminate. Men, women, and children can be victims.
This abuse takes many forms. It can be physical, emotional, or sexual. Victims often suffer in silence. They're afraid to speak out. The impact of this abuse is devastating. It can lead to physical injuries, emotional trauma, and psychological problems.
Victims often feel trapped. They feel like they have nowhere to turn. This sense of hopelessness can be overwhelming. It's important to remember that no one deserves to be abused. If you are a victim of domestic violence, please reach out for help. There are people who care and want to support you. You don't have to go through this alone. Living with domestic violence is incredibly painful. Victims experience fear, anxiety, and depression. They often feel alone and helpless. To cope with this trauma, many turn to drugs or alcohol.
Substance abuse provides temporary relief. It numbs the emotional pain. It can also help victims forget their problems for a while. They may feel more confident or in control after using.
Sadly, this relief is short-lived. Substance abuse is a dangerous coping mechanism. It doesn't address the root cause of the pain. Instead, it creates new problems. Victims can become dependent on drugs or alcohol. This addiction makes it even harder to escape the abusive situation. It's crucial to remember that there are healthier ways to cope.
Abusers often use substance abuse as a tool for control. They might encourage their partner's addiction. They might even supply the drugs or alcohol. Why? Because an addicted partner is easier to manipulate.
When under the influence, victims are more vulnerable. They're less likely to fight back. They're more likely to tolerate abuse. This creates a dangerous power imbalance.
Abusers might also use their partner's addiction against them. They might threaten to hurt them if they try to get sober. They might blame the addiction for the abuse. This manipulation keeps victims trapped in the cycle of violence. It's important to remember that addiction is not a sign of weakness, and it's never an excuse for abuse. Trapped in a downward spiral, the vicious cycle of abuse and addiction. Domestic violence and substance abuse are a dangerous combination. They create a vicious cycle that can be hard to break.
The abuse leads to emotional pain, which leads to substance abuse. The substance abuse then makes the abuse worse.
Victims often feel trapped in this cycle. They feel like they can't escape. The addiction makes it hard to think clearly or make rational decisions. The fear of the abuser keeps them from reaching out for help.
This cycle can have devastating consequences. It can lead to job loss, financial ruin, and health problems. It can also lead to legal troubles and even death. Breaking this cycle requires professional help and support.
Isolation and addiction, a dangerous combination. Domestic violence thrives in isolation. Abusers often isolate their victims from loved ones. They control their finances and limit their access to support.
This isolation makes victims even more vulnerable to substance abuse. When you're isolated, you're more likely to turn to drugs or alcohol for comfort. You don't have a support system to help you cope with the stress and trauma. This isolation also makes it harder to get help for addiction.
Abusers know that isolation works in their favor. They use it to maintain control and power over their victims. This is why it's so important for victims to reach out for help, even if they're afraid. Breaking free, the need for integrated support services. Breaking the cycle of domestic violence and substance abuse is possible, but it's not easy. It requires professional help and a strong support system.
Victims need access to integrated support services that address both issues together. Traditional treatment programs often focus on one issue at a time, but this approach is not effective for victims of domestic violence. They need help with substance abuse and the trauma of the abuse.
Integrated support services provide comprehensive care. They offer individual therapy, group therapy, and medication-assisted treatment. They also provide legal advocacy, housing assistance, and job training.
These services help victims heal from the trauma of abuse and overcome addiction. They empower them to rebuild their lives and create a safer future.
A call to action, awareness, compassion, and coordinated efforts for lasting change. Domestic violence and substance abuse are complex issues with far-reaching consequences. They affect individuals, families, and communities. Addressing these issues requires a multifaceted approach.
We need to raise awareness about the link between domestic violence and substance abuse. We need to educate the public about the signs of abuse and addiction, and we need to encourage victims to seek help.
We also need to improve access to integrated support services. We need to provide more funding for these services, and we need to train more professionals to provide trauma-informed care.
By working together, we can break the cycle of domestic violence and substance abuse. We can create a world where everyone feels safe and supported. We can empower victims to heal and reclaim their lives.